Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss efforts to determine what the next generation will learn. But first, I recently spoke with Dr. Kyla Thomas of the Center for Economic and Social Research at the University of Southern California about her recent paper titled The Psychology of Distinction: How Cultural Tastes Shape Perceptions of Class and Competence in the U.S. The paper is to be published in Poetics and is sole-authored. Dr. Thomas, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, your paper considers cultural tastes, perceptions of social status, and perceptions of competence. But culture and taste that's arguably infinite. What about culture are you referencing? I mean, is there some way you're getting access into this domain? What counts as culture? What kinds of culture are you talking about?
So I was specifically interested in people's preferences for different kinds of, I guess, forms of culture. So it specifically kind of leisure tastes. So, you know, what kind of sports do people like? What kind of music do they like? What food do they eat, or are they, you know, do they have a preference for? So that's specifically what I mean by culture and cultural taste in this paper.
So how are they, is it sort of an issue of, like you say tomato, I say tomato? Are there any kind of, along what are these dimensions? Is there a dimension along which these are arrayed, or some kind of distinction between, or is it everything is in its own, when you say culture and taste, it's pretty much, for example, every musical taste, and they're all kind of, you just throw them in a grab bag and they're all just different?
Well, I mean, what I was interested in is kind of the way in which they are arranged and kind of how we think about them. So there's this theory in the sociology of culture that, you know, some tastes are perceived as higher status or better or more valuable than others. So there's this French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, and in the 1960s, he did conducted research in France to try to understand in what ways our cultural preferences, our tastes patterned, specifically by social class. And what he found was that elite, so people from higher class backgrounds, were more likely to display a taste for traditionally highbrow culture, that's kind of classical forms of art, music, more so than people from lower class backgrounds. And not only that, he argues that they cultivate these tastes in childhood, and when they display them in social settings, specifically in formal settings like educational settings, that their tastes are rewarded by gatekeepers. They're perceived as signals of higher status and greater merit. And so what I wanted to explore was, you know, do we see a similar kind of cultural hierarchy in the US, where traditionally highbrow tastes are perceived as signals of greater status and competence relative to traditionally kind of lowbrow or popular cultural tastes?
So what would count as, I mean, if you were sort of walking down the street or going into a store or doing some activity, I'm trying to figure out what would be, you have this taste experience or object, and which ones would you classify, just as a sort of to get grounded, which would we classify as highbrow, lowbrow? I guess there's a middle brow. Could you give us a few examples? We don't need, because there are infinite number of cultural objects.
Right. And there's debate about it too. I mean, so I was interested in, you know, traditionally defined highbrow culture. So basically the kinds of leisure pursuits or, you know, preferences or interests that have historically been tied to the upper classes. So that would be, you know, in the case of music, like classical music, opera, in the case of sports, I mean, it does matter kind of what your national context is, but like, polo, for example. And then in the case of food, European dishes. So, like French food, although, like coq au vin, for example, used to be like a food of the peasants, but eventually, it became kind of perceived as a more elite kind of food. So that's what I mean by highbrow. Although, there's certainly debate within the US about, is highbrow culture, what we think about as highbrow, also changing. But for this paper, I was interested in traditional forms of highbrow culture.
Okay, so why would we, if Bourdieu has already established that, this connects to people's perceptions of other people's class and competence, why would we think it wouldn't be that way in the US case?
I mean, well, the US is a very different cultural context. So egalitarianism is pretty central to the US's kind of identity and discourse. And there has been research, especially in interview-based research, where scholars have found that people at least express a kind of more laissez-faire attitude towards cultural taste. So and I actually saw this in the experiment that I ultimately did to test this question, people left comments at the end of the survey, and I saw the same kind of language in how people talked about the very task I was asking them to do, that, maybe you do recognize that some tastes are, elite or highbrow and others are lowbrow, but you're not going to judge anyone on the basis of their taste. And so some researchers found that, that people did express this kind of attitude when they talked about taste. And then also in the last few decades, we've seen more evidence of what they call cultural omnivorousness in the US, a taste for both highbrow and lowbrow cultural forms, that elites, they're not just exclusively consuming highbrow culture anymore, or expressing a preference for highbrow culture. They're also kind of dabbling in lowbrow cultural forms, like, say they like classical music, but they also like bluegrass, which was kind of a traditionally lowbrow kind of music. So all of these, these studies altogether suggest that maybe it's not the case that people assign the kind of value to highbrow culture in the US that Bourdieu observed among the French.
Okay, so, and you indicated you did some kind of experiment. So how does, I'm just wondering, how can you experiment with taste? People have their taste and that's it. So what did you do?
So I created these little social media profiles, fictitious social media profiles, and included some details about where the person was from, what their name was, their age, and then I also included, on Facebook, for example, you can, say the kinds of things that you like, and so I included favorite music, favorite sports, favorite food in this little profile, and then I randomly assigned food, music, and sports preferences to that profile. And I drew from a range of highbrow, middlebrow, and lowbrow preferences, just based on how different preferences have been characterized in the literature on cultural taste. So that's how people were assigned their tastes.
So someone could have, I guess I have two. First question is, someone could have highbrow music taste, but a lowbrow food taste,
yes,
or vice versa, or they could be highbrow for the sports, food, and music, or they could be, so it was all different combinations.
Yeah, and that's what I I wanted the different combinations because I wanted to understand what power does, first of all, what power does even the presence of a single highbrow taste have? So, say two of your tastes are lowbrow, but one of them is highbrow. Does that matter? Is highbrow taste that powerful? And then, is the effect of highbrow taste cumulative or additive? So, does having 3 highbrow tastes, is that more powerful than having 1? And yeah, so that was the goal. And what I was looking at in terms of effects is I was looking at the effect of these signals within the social media profile on people's respondents' ratings of the social class of the person in the profile, and then the competence of the person in the profile.
So it wasn't that a real person, you weren't assigning the taste to a real person saying,
right,
you must listen to this music. You were
right.
creating these fictitious profiles and then asking other people to assess them, I guess.
Yes, people who are a part of a national survey panel. So they're accustomed to taking surveys, and in one of their surveys, they were presented with this experiment where they were just asked to evaluate or give their first impression of the person being described in the profile.
So what did you find? Did taste matter for people's assessment of person's social class in the US?
Yes, I did find that. I find that, so first of all, I found that, just the presence of highbrow taste in a profile, whether it's 1 or 3, has a positive effect on perceptions of class and perceptions of competence. And then I also found that the effect is additive. So increasing the number of increasing the number of highbrow tastes you have relative to non-highbrow tastes positively influences your perceived class and competence. And then I also was interested in sources of variation in how these social media profiles were evaluated. So, for example, does it matter what kind of taste you're signaling? So does it matter that your highbrow taste is a highbrow taste for music versus, a taste for highbrow sports or food? Because there's some evidence, although there's not a ton of literature on this yet, that within the domain of music, that people still subscribe to pretty strong stereotypes about what constitutes highbrow versus lowbrow taste, whereas you kind of see more fluidity or more flexibility in how people perceive or taste or consume culture within the domain of sports or food. And I do find that signals of highbrow musical taste seem to have a stronger effect on perceptions than signals of highbrow sports or food taste. That was also interesting.
Well, one question, you have these cultural objects assigned to or used because they're either highbrow, middlebrow, or lowbrow in the profiles that you made. And you've identified an impact of highbrow, but is there no penalty for lowbrow, or maybe a different kind of positive thing for a lowbrow, or is it just it's just highbrow or not? It's not.
Yeah, so I did look at that, and one of my hypotheses was that you would see this penalty. So it wasn't just that highbrow taste would be rewarded, but that lowbrow taste would have a negative effect on perceptions of class and competence. And when I tested this, in my statistical models, initially I did see this negative effect, but then when I accounted for both the presence of highbrow taste and the presence of lowbrow taste, I found that the negative effect of lowbrow taste went away. So essentially what I found was that it's really the presence of highbrow tastes in a profile, and the absence of non-highbrow tastes in a profile that seems to have an effect on social perceptions. So there's not really a penalty for having lowbrow tastes. It's more just kind of a reward for having highbrow tastes.
So substantively or theoretically, how do you make sense of these patterns? I mean, what's going on underneath this phenomena that you've identified?
Well, so kind of the theory that guided my research strategy is cultural capital theory. So it's a theory that was developed by Pierre Bourdieu, where he argues, not only, do these, does it matter kind of our cultural tastes patterned by our class backgrounds? Not only are they perceived as signals of higher status or competence, but they translate into actual rewards in institutions. So for example, in the field of education, you might find that students who display highbrow cultural preferences or practices get better grades, or they have higher school placement when they're applying for college. Or in the labor market, you might find that they get better job offers or higher pay. And there is some evidence that people with traditionally highbrow tastes do experience better educational and occupational outcomes. But a lot of it is associational. So you see that there's this association between what your tastes are and what your outcomes are. But causation is a little trickier to discern. And there have been some experimental studies that have tried to in resume, and actually I did one of these in resumes, signaling taste through a resume, applying for jobs and seeing, do these signals of taste actually have an effect on your rate of employer callback? And there does seem to be some evidence that it does. But still, what these studies have missed, although these more recent studies have started to get into this more, is the kind of the psychological assumption that underlies the kind of cultural system or cultural hierarchy that Bourdieu theorizes, which is this idea that, that people actually perceive these tastes as more valuable, as higher status. And so that's what I was trying to kind of see and demonstrate in this study, was that this, that's why I called it the psychology of distinction, that this kind of cognitive structure, this internalized system of evaluation actually exists in the US. And so, demonstrating its existence on a national level, then you can think about what are the implications of that. So, basically it suggests that in social settings where competence is a valued characteristic, so these are typically task-oriented settings, we would expect to find that people who then display traditionally highbrow tastes are likely to maybe get a better position, receive more deference, get certain opportunities that people who don't have those tastes get.
Are these evaluations coming from everyone equally? So I mean, is it that everyone is evaluating on average? I don't mean to say 330 million people are doing exactly the same thing, but I mean that there's no systematic difference between a person's own socioeconomic position and their, such that someone who's wealthy, someone who's not wealthy would both evaluate the person with highbrow culture higher, or is it different, that people are they're different? Maybe the people who are not wealthy value it more than people who are wealthy, or vice versa. Were you able to probe a little bit on that question?
Yes, so that was another thing that I looked at, was, does it matter what your own class position is, in terms of how you evaluate the cultural tastes of others? And my hypothesis was that people with higher levels of education or income, essentially people, those are my proxies for social class, would assign a higher class position and greater levels of competence to people who signal traditionally highbrow tastes. And this was based on a pretty rich psychological literature, which shows that people tend to favor their in-group and reject their out-group. And so if you think about highbrow taste as, a marker, not just of, what one likes or doesn't like, but of one's background, one's class background, then you would expect people who share that class background to favor or to reward those tastes. And that's what I find, that people with higher levels of education and higher income are assigned a higher social class and greater levels of competence to people who signal highbrow tastes. And I also actually find that this effect seems to be stronger among women than among men. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because there is some research on which shows that elite women consume highbrow culture at a higher rate than elite men. And this kind of goes back to women historically kind of being the bearers of culture and cultural reproduction in families. And there's kind of this cultural expectation for women that men don't seem to experience. And so it kind of makes sense that women would kind of buy into this cultural system more than men.
So are these effects, this giving more expectation of confidence to someone who is displaying a highbrow culture and effects like that, is it produced, this may be a speculation, but in your mind and your thinking, are you thinking this is produced consciously? And I ask because I wonder, is this something that people can interrupt? Not just the person who's has the taste, but the people who are doing the evaluation. So in other words, I guess I'm asking, are your findings a matter of understanding the world or a matter of changing it? So
you found my secret agenda.
No, I'm just wondering,
No, I think they are both conscious and unconscious. I think it is fully possible for people to be made aware of what they're doing and the implications of it. I mean, people were already aware of it in their comments at the end of the survey. I mean, they were uncomfortable. They said in their, at the end, I asked, do you have any comments? And just some people, I wasn't systematically collecting this data, but people said, I don't like to prejudge people, or, it doesn't matter, like, if you like this thing or that thing, like, what matters is if you're a good person. People just offered these comments at the end of the survey. They were uncomfortable with this task. So there was this idea that you shouldn't judge other people on the basis of their taste. And yet at the same time, we see around us, in our daily conversations, people are pretty open about thinking, certain tastes are trash and others are, good or bad. Or, Tinder and Spotify once partnered to help match people on the basis of their musical tastes. So it's considered kind of legitimate. It's legitimate to judge, to match on the basis of taste, to form impressions on the basis of taste. If anything, probably the change would be revealing the consequences of this kind of matching. People, I think, aren't aware of what you're actually doing when you form these judgments, and also where these judgments come from. We all kind of, in educational, we all go through school, and in school, a lot of us are taught that, classical music, opera, these kind of the fine arts are good, they are valuable, they're worthy of your attention, and these other kind of popular cultural forms maybe are also, are fun, but they're not going to, get you into college, or, they're less worthy of your attention. And what we don't realize is that, this hierarchy that we all kind of buy into or have to participate in is, was designed by elites to benefit elites. And so, when I think about, what are the implications, or what is the change that this, kind of hierarchy requires? First, probably an acknowledgement of origins of this hierarchy, of the consequences of it, and then, that's kind of a starting point. And then you get into questions of, okay, well, then, I think about like the research I've done on discrimination on the basis of cultural taste in the labor market. Well, what's the solution? Do we, not take taste into account, even though taste seems to matter or be rewarded or still be valued, highbrow taste, or do we try to kind of celebrate, diversity of tastes? It's a tough question. It's what I'm thinking about, though.
Well, Dr. Thomas, it is a tough question, but it's fascinating insights that you've provided, and on a question that's kind of under the radar for a lot of us, but apparently, can have big impact. Mm-hmm. So on how we see the world and how we see the people around us. So I want to thank you for doing this amazing work and for sharing it with us today.
No, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Our final segment concerns government efforts to censor the truth. On June 6th, CNN reported on the possibly inadvertent violation of state opposition to mention of an embarrassing and fatal incident. Apparently, a very popular internet entrepreneur showed a dessert on their shopping program. Possibly unbeknownst to them, the dessert could be interpreted as a reminder of the embarrassing and fatal incident. The shopping program was interrupted, and while the host explained the interruption as a result of technical difficulties and promised to return soon, he has not been seen on air since. In the wake of this incident, many young fans who knew next to nothing of the history have taken to the internet to ask about the incident, exactly the opposite of what embarrassed authorities wanted to happen. The specific incident involves Chinese prohibition of mention of the Tiananmen Square Massacre. The host, Li Jiaqi, showed a plate of Viennetta ice cream. The squarish dessert had Oreo cookies on its sides placed in a way that resembled wheels, a chocolate ball on top that could be seen as a turret, and a chocolate stick protruding from the ball, a visual representation of the gun. Taken together, the dessert could be seen to resemble a tank that might have stormed Tiananmen Square and joined in gunning down hundreds or thousands of democracy protesters. Sociologically speaking, the Chinese government effort to keep the next generation in the dark about its oppressive history is a common government move. Indeed, a rough analog is present in the US today. Some state legislatures are passing laws meant to constrain what teachers can say to their students about racism and sexism. The odd feature of how these laws are proposed in the US context is that their advocates often preface their position by attacking something that they call critical race theory. But the critical race theory they are attacking bears no resemblance to the critical race theory that scholars, such as Cheryl Harris, Derek Bell Jr., Marie Matsuda, Kimberly Crenshaw, Alan David Freeman, Lani Guinier, and others have developed. One important difference between the politician's caricature of critical race theory on the one hand and the actual critical race theory developed by scholars on the other is that the politician's version claims that critical race theory accuses all white people living today of being racist. In fact, critical race theory, as designed by scholars, focuses on systems, not on individuals. Critical race theory, as designed by scholars, explains the racist conditions and outcomes of the contemporary United States as a result of systems that exist in the United States and often predate anyone living today. The sad fact is that while the caricature vilifies critical race theory as an accusation against every white person alive today, actual critical race theory views the issue of blame as a divisive and unnecessary distraction. Actual critical race theory is not concerned with blame. It is concerned with establishing a just nation within which the sundered fabric of society can finally be knitted together. The decision of critical race theory scholars to focus on systems rather than individuals is not really an uncommon one. As a theoretical move, focusing on systems and structures isn't even controversial. We know that systems and structures exist because without them, we couldn't have an economy, we couldn't have a legal system, we couldn't have a government. An example of what this means in the frame of critical race theory may be helpful. An analogy. Imagine that decades ago, a city ordinance was adopted that requires every house to have a brick fireplace with the full length of the chimney visible from the outside. So for decades, every house built in the city has such a fireplace and chimney. Now, however, in the more recent period, analysts have learned that those fireplaces will collapse in an earthquake. This means that everyone is at risk owing to that city ordinance. In this particular example, looking back, nobody set out to make chimneys that would collapse and kill. Yet, the city's rule about fireplaces has put everyone at risk. Knowing the city ordinance and how it guided everyone in the same direction for decades, it would be silly to blame someone today for the risk. Contemporary blame in this connection is worse than irrelevant. It is a distraction. However, blameless though today's city residents are, we might ask today's city residents to address the problem. Long dead city leaders can't do anything about the problem. The only people who can do something about it are the people who are here now. And to do it, they don't need to blame anyone. They only need to act. This is the crux of actual critical race theory. Far from blaming anyone, it really just focuses on the systems that have been handed down from the past, systems that may be shown to reproduce problems of the past. Having no interest in who is to blame for the conditions, critical race theory simply observes that adults living today are in a position to change the conditions. In order to be able to do that, however, everyone needs to understand the conditions and their source in systems and structures. Adherents of critical race theory are troubled when some drag their feet and refuse to bring about change, but they can hope that the next generation will respond differently. Seen in this way, those attacking children's access to knowledge are not satisfied with simply maintaining a destructive set of conditions in their own time. They are seeking to undermine the next generation's knowledge and thus ability to build a more just and less divisive society. What will this effort to disempower our children mean? It's 33 years since the Tiananmen Square Massacre, the democracy protests and the massacre that followed. In 33 years, today's American children will be adults. Will state repression of the truth of American racism and other forms of American oppression prevent their learning of the truth, or simply slow it? If those children of today who will be adults of tomorrow stumble upon the truth, will they become curious about their nation's shameful violence toward the innocent, just as today's Chinese teenagers, upon stumbling upon the truth, have become curious about their nation's shameful violence toward the innocent? If those Americans of tomorrow become curious, will they accept the whitewashing of history and venerate their ancestors in part for doing so? Or will they make a different decision? A decision to learn, teach, and act upon the truth? If they decide to live in truth, will they denigrate us, their ancestors, for bequeathing to them unnecessary conflict, repression, division, and fear, when we might have spared them by effectively addressing the problems ourselves in a way that ignores blame in favor of solutions? American leaders frequently denounce atrocities and human rights violations committed elsewhere. But the truth, when wielded by those of integrity, is often a two-edged sword. And those of integrity know, or should know, that while China has a history replete with multiple human rights violations, including the Tiananmen Square Massacre, the United States has the 3/5 Compromise, the New York City Draft Massacre, the Sand Creek Massacre, the Ebenezer Creek Massacre, the Los Angeles Chinatown Massacre, the Wounded Knee Massacre, Wilmington, Tulsa, Rosewood, Tule Lake War Relocation Center, the My Lai Massacre, the Upstairs Lounge Massacre, the Slocum Massacre in Texas, the Latimer